The next enemy we are going to work on is going to be the bug. And the bug is going to be fairly similar compared to the scout. Let's go through what we are going to do. We have to start with a character body 2D. This should be fairly straightforward. To display the bug though, we are not going to use a sprite, but rather an animated sprite 2D. This one is going to get an attack and a walk animation. Next up, there will be a notice area 2D and an attack area 2D. If the player is entering the notice area, then the bug will move towards the player. And if the player enters the attack area, the bug will attack the player with a cooldown and an attack animation. Besides that, there should also be a shader if the bug gets hit, and then the bug should disappear or get killed after a few shots. All of that is going to be fairly straightforward, and there's literally no new knowledge we have to talk about, which means all of this can be a really good exercise. I want you guys to pause this and create a more complex scene on your own, and see how far you get. You basically want to copy quite a bit from the scout and then make appropriate changes. Here we are in Godot, and I want to create a new scene. The root node has to be a character body 2D. This I want to rename right away to bug. Then I can save the entire scene, and I want to save it inside of enemies with bug.tscn as the name. That's looking really good. Next up, we have to work on the actual images that we can see. And for that, I want to have an animated sprite 2D. This animated sprite 2D needs to have an animation, so sprite frames. I want to create new sprite frames. If I click on that one again, we get the sprite frames panel. In there, I want to create two animations. We have one for attack, and then a second one for walking, or just walk. Both of these will need a ton of graphics. We get all of that from graphics, enemies, bug, and there we have attack and walk. Let's start with attack. I want to copy all of these images and simply drag them in there. With that, I have an animation that I can play, although by default it is incredibly slow. That is because we are currently playing this animation at 5 frames per second. If I change this to 30, then this is looking much better. Besides that, we have the walk animation, which we get from the walk folder, and in there, I want to simply drag all of the images and update the frames per second. If I now play all of this, we have a walking animation. There are some smaller things we have to do. First of all, the walk animation we do want to loop, so this looping icon should be enabled. However, for the attack, we only want to play this once, so looping for this one should be disabled. That way, we're only playing this animation once. Besides that, I can now minimize the sprite frames panel. We have two more issues with this current image. Number one is it is way too large. If you look at the blue area, this is the window, which means that this bug at the moment is about 2 to 3 times the size, which would be way too large. For that, inside of transform, I want to update the scale to 0.1. And that might even still be a tiny bit too large. Let's go 0.07. Once again, just play around with the numbers and see what feels good. Besides that, this bug has to look to the right. That way, later on, we can use the look at function to make the bug look at the player. So I want to add a rotation of 90 degrees. With that, we can display the bug. Next up, the bug also needs to have a collision shape 2D. For the collision shape, I think a capsule shape would be best. Although for this one, I have to rotate the shape by 90 degrees, and now I can size it to roughly cover the area of the bug. We don't have to be perfect for this one, but I think something like this is roughly okay. You could be working with a collision polygon here if you want to put a bit more work in. Next up, we will need two areas. So area 2D, and the first one is going to be the notice area, and this is going to need a collision shape as well, which has to be a circle shape. And this circle shape we want to make reasonably large. Let's say something like this. And this is going to activate the bug once the player enters it. Let's rename it right away to the notice area. Once we have that, I want to add another area 2D. This area 2D is going to be the attack area. If the player enters this area, the bug is going to attack. which means for the collision shape 2D, we still want to have a circle shape, but this circle shape has to be really small. Let's say something like this. Then I can minimize the two area 2Ds, and we are more or less done. I suppose what we could be doing inside of the outside level, I want to get rid of the scout, because this one is basically done, and instead I want to add the bug into the enemy's node 2D, and then move the bug around to a position where we can work with it a little bit better. So if I now move the bug in there, we can see we have a very basic bug with collisions. So that's a pretty good start, although it doesn't do very much right now. Next up, one thing I forgot that is really important, we have to update the collisions. So for the collision shape of the bug, I want to go to collision and update the layers and the mask. This bug should be on layer 2 and it can see the player, the other enemies, and the projectiles. Besides that, we have the notice area, and this one has to be on layer 5 and can only see the player. Same for the attack area, this one has to be on layer 5 as well, and can once again also only see the player. It is really easy to forget the collision layers and masks, so this is something you always want to keep in mind. Now we have that, the bug can get a script. Bug.gd is perfectly fine, and this can be empty by default. So now we have a script for the bug. For this one, I first of all want to create a couple of variables. Let's say the first one could be var active, and this one has to be a boolean, which by default is false. Besides that, I want to have a speed variable, which is going to be an integer with a default value of 300. After that, I want to have a vulnerable variable, a boolean, which is true by default. And finally, var layer near, which is also a boolean, which is going to be false by default. On top of that, I also want to connect the attack area and the notice area to the script via the signals. So for the attack area, we want to have body entered, and we want to have body exited. Both of these don't really have to do very much. All they do is update player near. If the player is entering this area, player near is going to be true, and if the player is exiting this area, player near is going to be false. Besides that, I want to have the notice area and connect this one with body entered. This one is going to update active and set it to true. And then finally, for the last signal, if the player is exiting the notice area 2D, then active should be false. All of these, I think, are fairly straightforward. We are checking if the player is near, if the bug can attack the player, and if the player is entering the notice area, then we want to have the bug as active. That way the bug can walk in just a bit. Before we get to that though, Godot is giving us 4 warnings. And that is because we are having the body parameter, but we are never using it. So for that, I want to add underscores to keep Godot happy. There we go. Now we don't get any more warnings. And with that, I can minimize all of these functions so they are not getting in the way. After that, the really important part in this is going to be an underscore process function. Inside of there, we have to get a velocity, which is going to be a direction multiplied by the speed that we already have. Now direction we don't have right now, so we have to create it. Var direction, and this we get with globals.player position. And if I type this correct, this is also going to work. And from that, we want to subtract the current position of the bug. So position, and we are good to go. Now this is going to give us a position as a vector 2D, and this we have to normalize. That way the speed stays constant. And let me expand this a bit. And now we can check if the bug is active. And if that is the case, I want to run the move and slide function so that the bug is moving. And with that, if I run the code, we are getting an error because this shouldn't be player position. This should just be player pos. Now let's try this again. The game is going to run. And now if I get close enough to the bug is going to move towards the player. And if we move outside of the area, the bug stops moving. Now, for debugging purposes, one thing that you could be doing is under debug, you could have visible collision shapes. If you have activated this one, then inside of the game, you can see all of the collision areas, which helps a lot to see what's going on. So there you can see, if we enter in this area, the bug starts to follow us. And well, this is looking really good. Cool. Next up, besides moving the bug, I also want to make the bug look at the player. For that, I need the global's player position, and that should be pretty much all we need. If I now go into the area of the bug is looking at us, and that's looking pretty good. That means I can go back to debug and disable the visible collision shapes, because what I want to work on is the animation of the bug. Specifically, if the player is walking into the notice area, then I want to start playing the animated sprite 2D, and what I want to play is the walk animation. And this shouldn't be place, this should be play. Since this one is looping, we only have to start playing it once. Let's try. If I now get in there, we are getting a walking animation. Although, once we get outside of the area, the walking animation continues. For that, inside of this function, we want to get the animated sprite 2D and then stop the current animation. Once we have that, I can get into the notice area. So, and if I go outside of it, the bug stops moving and animating. So this is perfect. That means I can now minimize both of these functions and work on the attack animation. This is going to happen inside of onAttackArea body exited or entered. If that is the case, besides setting player near to true, I want to get the animated sprite 2D and then play another animation, which would be attack. Let's try that one. And once Godot has finished loading, I can get to the bug. And there you can see, it's a bit hard to see, but we had one attack animation. Let me play all of this again, actually, just to make sure you see it. If I now moonwalk into the bug, there we can see we had one attack animation. Once this attack animation is done, I want to hurt the player. This we can do via the animated sprite 2D, and in there we have one signal called animation finished. There's also animation looped in case you have an animation that loops. Since this one is looping, it wouldn't trigger animation finished, it would only trigger animation loop. But in our case, we want to get animation finished and connect this to our script. In there, we now have another function, and all we really want to do in there. First of all, we want to check if the player is still near. If that is the case, I want to get globals and then get the health and reduce it by, let's say, 10. With that, I can run all of this again. And now if I get the bug attacking me, we are reducing the health of the player. So this is perfect. Also, the bug keeps on following us. And well, this is working. And what is really annoying me right now is that we have a debugger warning. This is because we are not using the delta inside of the process function. Now Godot's happy again. Next up, I want to add some timers. For that, inside of the bug, I want to add a node, and this node I want to rename to timer. Actually, timers. There are two timers I want to create. So a timer and duplicate it. The first timer is going to be the, let's call it the attack timer. Besides that, I also want to have a hit timer. Both of these we have to connect to the script. So via the signals, I want to connect the timeout signal for both of them. The onHit timer timeout function we can ignore for now. What I care much more about is the onAttack timer timeout. If that one is triggered, I want to get the animated sprite 2D again, and then once again play the attack animation. And then inside of the onAnimated sprite animation finished function, I want to call this timer. So attack timer, and I want to start it. And let's say after 1 second, I want to start the attack again. So for that, I want to have a wait time of 1 second. One-shot should be enabled and auto-start should not be enabled. I can now walk into the attack area of the bug. The bug is going to attack, and after 1 second, we get another attack. And that is looking really good. Cool. That means we can minimize these two functions, and now we can work on the bug getting hit. And let me minimize a lot more. We don't need any of this. The next function we need to be able to hit the bug is going to be function hit. Once again, any scene that has this function can be hit by a laser. For now, let me simply print bug was hit. Although for that to work, like we have seen in the scout, we need groups. So inside of the groups, we have entity and scouts. And the bug should also be inside of the entities, which means with the bug selected, I want to go to groups and add the bug to the entity group. And now, if I shoot at the bug, we get bug was hit. And if I shoot a grenade, we get bug was hit many, many times. So that's looking pretty good. Inside of this function, I want to check if the bug is vulnerable first of all. If that is the case, I want to set vulnerable to false and then get the hit timer and start it. Inside of the hit timer, all the way at the bottom, I simply want to get vulnerable and then set it back to true. And the duration of this hit timer is going to be, let's say, 0.2 seconds, like we had for the scout. One shot should also be enabled. That means now I can minimize this hit timer timeout function. And on top of that, inside of if vulnerable, I want to print bug was hit. I should have gotten rid of that print statement. Now let's try all of this. I can still hit the bug. And if I shoot a grenade, we should see a bit less of the hit statement. So this is looking really good. We only get this bug was hit every 0.2 seconds, which means for this one, we can create another variable for the health amount. Let's say a bug is going to get 20 health points. And if the bug is getting hit, health should be reduced by, I guess we can keep on working with 10. After that, if the health of the bug is smaller or equal to 0, then we want to queue free and get rid of the bug entirely. Let's try all of this. And now I should be able to shoot at the bug twice, 1, 2, and the bug disappears. Perfect. Finally then, for the last bit, we have to add the shader. For that, with the animated sprite 2D selected, because remember, this is the only thing visible for this bug. I want to go to Material, give it a new shader material, click on this one, then a new shader, and bug.gd shader seems like a good name. Now I can click on this bug, and there we have bug.gd shader, and also we have the scout.gd shader. In my case, to save some time, I'm going to copy the entirety of the script for the scout and paste it into the bug. And I guess there's one thing I should mention, and that is for an actual game, the scout and the bug and even the player and later on the drone, they all share quite a bit of code. And you could use inheritance here quite a bit to simplify the game, or at the very least have much less code to write. But in my case, I want to avoid that because it would make the game much more complicated. Which is why I am copying code here, but you could challenge yourself to work with inheritance to write much less code. But anyway, now our bug has a shader, which means inside of the script. And I want to minimize all of that. If the bug gets to be vulnerable, I want to get the animated sprite 2D. On there, I have a material. And on there, I want to update a shader or a shader parameter with set shader parameter. The parameter I want to target is going to be progress. And the value I want to set it to is going to be 1. And now I can run all of this again and shoot at the bug. And it becomes really bright white, so this we might want to work on. For example, what we could be doing is set this to 0.9 and try this one again. That's still quite white. So I guess with the material, We can update the color, not a pure white, but instead a more greenish color. Something like this. You still want to have it quite white, but play around with all of that. And that is feeling much better. Although possibly a bit too dark, so a bit brighter. And final attempt. That is looking okay. Cool. Next up, we want to go to the on-hit timer timeout. And after we have set vulnerable back to true, I want to once again get the animated sprite 2D, get the material, and then set a shader parameter. I want to set the progress back to 0. With that, the bug should stop lighting up really quickly, and that feels good. Perfect. So with that, we have quite a complex scene. So we have a lot of functions. Most of them are signals though, so nothing complicated is really happening here. But I hope all of this is illustrating that you can create a pretty complex scene quite fast once you understand the basics. Now that being said though, there's one more thing that I would like to add. 2 things actually. Both of those are going to be inside of a node 2D. This node 2D is going to be called particles. And there are 2 particles I want to work with. Although both of them are going to be GPU particles. The first one is going to be hit particles. And the second one, so I can duplicate this, is going to be def particles. To work with both of them. I want to have the hit particles and there give it a process material. And you can also see here, we can give this one a shader material as well. Basically, anything visible in Godot can have a shader. But in our case, we want to have a particle process material. For this one, I want to set the amount to 50. And to explain this one, I want to emit a couple of images every time the bug gets hit. And for that, if I go down, I want to use a texture. For that, inside of graphics, we have explosions. And there we have a grunge.png image. This I want to drag in there. And if you're doing that, you get some really weird results. What is happening here is that this image contains a couple of sub-images. We have one large image and we want to split this one up. But Godot doesn't do that by default. So we are getting all 6 of these images at the same time. But I only want to have a single one of them. For that, you want to go all the way down to material. Right now, this one is empty. And we could give this one a shader as well. Although this is not what I want. I want to give it a canvas item material. If I get that, I get a pure white color. Although in there, we have a particle animation. This is what I want to enable. This allows me to set animation H frames and animation V frames. So how many columns and rows I have inside of this animation. In my case, I have 6 columns and 1 row. This is going to split up the image into 6 separate columns. That's all I need inside of material. And next up, inside of the process material. I want to go to animation and then set the offset max to 1. That way, we get a random item picked from the textures available. Right now, this doesn't look great, but once we work with this, this is going to be much better. First of all, though, inside of visibility, I want to work with modulate and make all of this much darker. So a darkish, greenish color should be best here. Let's go with something like this. Maybe a bit more red, not too much. Something like this works perfectly fine. Next up, we don't need animation anymore. Instead, I want to update the emission shape. That one should be a sphere, and for the size, you can see if we make this larger, we get a larger area where we are emitting particles from. Although in this case, this one shouldn't be too large. I suppose the more noticeable one here would be scale, because right now all of this is way too large. So for the scale minimum, I want to go with 0.1, and then for the scale maximum, 0.3, and this feels much more appropriate, although still maybe even a bit too small. let's say 0.02 and 0.04. I suppose this one is okay, but once again, play around with this. Also, what we can do is give this a scale curve. If I click on that, I can add a new curve texture, and if I click on that, we can tell how large they are going to be. In my case, the starting size should be 1, but the ending size should be 0. Or at least something close to it. That way, the scale at the beginning is going to be 1, or whatever we set for scale minimum, and the final value is going to be 0. That is going to cover the scale. Next up, I want to work on the direction. So direction, and right now they always fall down. I also want to set Y to 1, and now they're moving to the bottom right. Although I want to increase the spread to 180, and now they are moving a bit more in a random direction. Although they are still falling down, and that is because of the gravity. If we're setting this to 0, now we get a much more interesting behavior. Or at the very least, we're not falling down anymore. What we also have to work on is the initial velocity. There we have velocity minimum and velocity maximum. I want to set the minimum to 1,500, and that is way too large. Let's say 200. I guess what I should have also worked on before we work on the velocity is all of this in time should be a one-shot. And now, if I set emitting to true, we get all of the particles once, but you can see the velocity is way too high. So velocity maximum, maybe try 300, try again. And I guess a bit better, but still much too large. So 100 and 200. Still very large, let's say 50 and 120 even. And yeah, I guess this is getting better. Let's say 100, final attempt. Okay, I am reasonably happy with this. There's one more change I do want to make. Inside of time, we have the lifetime of all of the particles. And those, I think, right now are a bit too long. So if we are setting this to 0.5 and then play the animation again, I guess this one is kind of working. Although now that we have a shorter lifetime, we could increase the velocity to 80 and 120. Like so. Try this again. I guess that is working better. We could reduce the amount of particles. And well, this is the kind of thing that you really want to play around with. But I'm happy with this one for now. Which means now, back in the code, as soon as we are getting hit, besides activating the shader, I also want to play the animation for the particles. I want to get the hit particles and then set emitting to true. If I now run all of this, I can shoot at the bug, and we get a short particle animation. Although, if we're killing the bug, we're not getting that anymore. To make that work, we have to work on the deaf particles. Although we don't actually need this one, let me actually remove it. Instead, I simply want to play the hit particles once the bug is dying. Which means, if health is going to be 0, and there shouldn't be a space after the 0, I also want to play the hit particles. So hit particles and emitting should be true. But this is technically working, but the issue is, if I hit the bug a second time, we do play the particles, but the bug disappears basically immediately. So we can't actually see the particles. To fix that, we can use await once again. I want to get the tree and then create a timer. Let's say for a duration of half a second. And then wait for the timeout of this timer, and then use Q3 to destroy the scene. So if we're trying this now, I can shoot the bug once, and then a second time, and then it disappears after about half a second. And now we also have another issue. I'm making a ton of mistakes in this part. We are setting particle emitting to true both times. So this we don't actually need. Let's try this again now, and we should be pretty much done. I can shoot the bug once, I can shoot it again, and then it disappears really fast. So this is working really well. And with that, we have the bug, which means now we have a scout and a bug, 2 enemies. Next up, we can work on the drone. I'll see you there. For the next part, I want to work on the drone. Fortunately, we already have a basic scene. So this entire section will be about updating the drone. There's not too much I want to do. Most importantly, once the drone is spotting the player, meaning once the player is moving into a notice area of the drone, then I want to start moving the drone towards the player, and while doing that, I also want to speed up the drone. Finally, once the drone is colliding with anything, I want it to explode. This should be reasonably straightforward. Let's implement all of it. Back in Godot, first of all, I want to open the drone. And let's see what we have so far. And there isn't very much. We have a character body 2D, we have a sprite, and we have a collision shape. Then in the script, we are giving the drone a direction and then moving it in that direction. On top of that, we have a hit function so the drone can be hit. Although for that to work properly, I want to put the drone into the entity group. So with group selected, I want to add it to entity. Next up, I want to give the drone an area 2D, which we can rename right away to notice area. Once we have that, we can give this thing a collision shape, which has to be a circle shape 2D with a certain radius. Something like this looks about right, but just to double check, in the outside area, I want to get rid of the bug and instead add the drone in there. And once again, we can move it into a better spot so we can actually work with it. And I guess in terms of distance, the drone should probably get a bit more. So ideally, the drone should come from outside of the player's view, so that it's a bit of a surprise. Yes, we can move it a bit further here. That is feeling much better. Next up, we want to connect the notice area 2D via a signal to the script. For this one, we only need on notice area body entered. We don't really care if the player is exiting the area. Once the player is noticed once, we want the drone to always move towards it. For that, I want to give the drone a variable. We can call this one active, which has to be a boolean, which by default is not true. It should be false. And once the player is entering the notice area, active should be set to true. That way, we can remove all of the stuff from inside of the process function and instead check if the drone is active, and then we can do something else. At least for now, there are 2 things that I want to do. The first one will be look at and globals player position. Besides that, I want to call move and slide. So we are moving the drone, although for that, I will need a velocity. And the velocity is going to be direction multiplied by speed. Although right now we don't have either of those. Speed is the easier thing to work on, at least for now. I want to create another variable called speed, which is an integer, which we can set to, I don't know, let's say 400. The direction we have to continuously update, so var direction inside of the process function. And this we have done multiple times by now. I want to get globals, and then the player position, which is the target vector, and from that I want to subtract the current position. And all of that should be normalized. And let me minimize the inspector so we can see all of it a bit better. So with that, we should have the drone move towards the player. Let's try all of that, and there we go. We have the drone move towards the player, although it's looking in the wrong direction, but that's easy to fix. With the sprite 2D selected, I want to go to transform and give it a rotation of 90 degrees. After doing that, you do want to double check if the collision area is still working, and this one is looking pretty good. Now we can try all of this again, and that looks about right. There are 2 more things we have to work on. Number 1, the drone should explode once there's any kind of collision. First of all though, I want to make it so that the player can shoot at the drone. And that is the kind of system we have implemented multiple times. I want to give the drone a timer, which is going to be a hit timer. And this hit timer, I want to connect via a signal right away. Also, on notice area body entered, I want to add an underscore to body, so Godot stops complaining. After that, I want to add another variable, which is going to be vulnerable, which will be a Boolean, which by default is going to be true. After that, and I guess I can move this vulnerable down a bit, we want to create var health, and let's say a drone gets 50 health, which is going to be an integer. I do want to be consistent here. Next up, inside of the hit function, I want to check if the drone is vulnerable, and if that is the case, I want to get health and subtract 10 points from it. After that, I want to set vulnerable to false, and I want to call the hit timer and start it. Finally, once the time has run out, I want to set vulnerable back to true. Also, I forgot the hit timer shouldn't be too long. This should only be 0.2 seconds. With that, there's one more thing that we need, and that is if health is smaller or equal than 0, then we want to kill the drone. With that, we should be able to shoot at it 5 times and it disappears. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Perfect. This kind of setup does work, but I'm not terribly happy with it. Basically, I want to play an explosion once the drone is colliding with something or once health goes below 0, i.e. the drone is dying. Which means this Q3 by itself is a bit unimpressive. So I want to have a proper animation. And this I'm doing via 2 nodes. The first one is going to be a sprite 2D, which will be the explosion. And for that, I'm going to go to Graphics, Explosions, and Explosion 3, drag this into a texture, and now we can see all of the explosions. Not exactly what we want. So I'm going to go to Animation, and then set H frames to 8 and V frames to 8 as well. That way, via the frame, we can control the animation progress. This progress we're going to control via an animation layer. This animation player is going to get one animation, explosion. That one is going to have a couple of property tracks, the most important one for the explosion. And in there, I want to get the frame. Right now, I don't know exactly how long this animation is supposed to be. So I'm going to set it to 4. That is definitely going to be enough. Next up, inside of the explosion, we get the keyframes. And first of all, we want to find the start animation, or the start frame to be a bit more specific. And since this animation starts, I guess there's a good starting point, I'm going to now click on the key, and then I can keep on clicking on it until we go through the entirety of the animation. And I guess 4 seconds are actually quite good. This is a long animation. Let's try to play it. And okay, a bit slow. This is because we are increasing the animation by 0.1 seconds. If we change this to 0.05 and get rid of all of this and try it again. So back at explosion, I want to start at frame 20. A bit later, I guess here's a good starting point. If I now add all of the frames, we are finishing the animation significantly faster. So now all of this plays much faster. And we can also tell that the animation is about 1.6 seconds long. Next up, I want to add another property track, also on the explosion. And for this one, we want to work with visible. I want to make this visible by default once the animation is starting, and then once the scene is ready. So inside of the scene, I want to work with a ready function, and I want to get the explosion and hide it. After that, I'm going to add another property track, and this one is for the sprite 2D, so the drone itself. And on there, I want to have visible again, And I pretty much want to go to a more busy part of the explosion, something like this, and then insert a key and set visible to false. That way we are making the drone disappear at a proper moment. And I guess at the beginning of this, we want to set the visibility to true. So that way we always start visible. I guess that works reasonably well. There's just one more thing that we do have to do, and that is a call method track on the drone itself. And in there, at the end of the animation, I want to insert a key, and the method I want to run is Q3. That way, by the end of the animation, the entire scene disappears. And with that, we don't have to call Q3 anymore. Instead, we can get the animation player and then play the explosion animation. Let's try all of this now. And we can't see the drone right now, but I am being blocked. So what happened is that Sprite2D became invisible. Basically what happened here is that in the animation player, when we are crossing this animation, if you look at the top left, we are toggling the visibility on or off, which can be a bit annoying, but the way around it is once a scene is ready, you are getting the Sprite2D and then show the node. That way, it's always going to be visible. And that feels better. Now if I shoot at it a couple of times, that's feeling better, although we should set the speed to 0, but that we can work on in a second. First of all though, there's another important thing I do want to work on. And that is a collision between the drone and the rest of the level. So basically, once the drone is colliding with literally anything, could be the player, or could be the environment, could even be another enemy. If that is the case, then I want to explode the drone as well. So we have to figure out how to do that. And you might be tempted here to look at the character body 2D, so the drone node, and look at node and signals. Maybe something's in there. Although you're going to find there isn't. There's nothing in here that we could use to check if there is a collision. We have to approach all of this slightly differently. And for that, we have another movement function. I covered that one all the way at the beginning. Instead of move and slide, I want to have move and collide. And this one does need to have some arguments. The most important one is a vector 2 that tells us in which direction we are going. Which in our case we have, that is simply going to be the velocity. If I now run all of this, we get some weird behavior. Now the drone is moving really, really fast. If I just run the game again, you can see the drone is immediately colliding with the player. Basically what's happening here is that move and collide is making the drone move way faster than move and slide it. The reason why that is happening is that move and collide doesn't automatically multiply velocity with delta time. If we do that, however, so velocity times delta and remove the underscore from delta, if we have that, we get the normal movement again. So this is looking better. So now you might be asking, what's the difference between move and collide and move and slide? And if there's an actual collision, you can see. Once the drone is colliding with anything, it doesn't slide along it, it simply stops moving. We only get movement if there's no collision. On top of that, this move and collide function is returning a value. So let's store it inside of var collision, and then let's see what we are getting. Meaning I want to print the collision, and now if I run all of this, we're getting object null, but once there is a collision, we get the kinematic collision with something. What this is returning is a collision object, which can give us some information, but in our case, we don't really care that much. All we really care about is if that collision object exists. Because if that is the case, we know there is a collision. If that is the case, we want to get the animation player and then play the explosion. Let's try all of that. And now, once there is any kind of object, we get an explosion. Cool. At this point, there are some minor things we still have to work on, and all of those are going to be your exercise. Number one, I want you guys to make the drone flash when it is hit. This should be done via shaders. Next up, make it speed up once it notices the player. Right now we have a constant speed, but the drone should be increasingly speeding up. You can do all of that via a tween. Finally, make the explosion hurt the player. Pause the video now and implement all of that. First of all, let's start with the shader. For that, with the sprite 2D, I want to go to Material, Material, New Shader Material, and on there, give it a new shader. That we can call drone.gd shader. If I now click on the shader, we are getting the shader. Once again, I am not going to do anything new in here. So I want to go to Scenes, Enemies, and then go to bug.gd shader and copy all of that. With that, if I select the material again, I get the two shader parameters for color and progress. All I really care about is the progress, and this one, if I hide and show the drone, you can see that we can update the color of the drone. So this one is working just fine. That is information we can now use inside of the hit function, and all we want to do is get this sprite 2D, the material, and then set a shader parameter. The parameter we want to target is called progress, and we want to set this to a 1. And then we can copy the entire line and go to onHitTimerTimeout and set the same value to 0. With that, if we shoot at the drone, it's going to flash up for a very short amount of time. Also, it should still explode, and that's perfect. That covers the first part. Next up, I want to make the drone speed up once it notices the player. For that, first of all, I want to give it a higher speed and rename all of this to max speed. And the max speed, let's say, could be 600. And then besides that, I want to have var speed, which is going to be 0. And also this is an integer. And then once the drone notices the player, I want to create a tween with create tween. And then this tween is going to tween a property on self. The property we want to work on is the speed. The maximum value is going to be max speed. And the duration is going to be, let's say, 6 seconds. If I now try all of this again, the drone should be speeding up. So it's starting really slow, and it should become increasingly fast. And that is working really well. Cool. There's one more thing I want to work on with the speed. And that is, if I run all of this again, I can make the drone explode quite easily. So a couple of shots. But now, once it explodes, the explosion is moving, which looks kind of weird. To fix that, I want to create another variable below speed. And let's simply call it var speed multiplier. I couldn't think of a better name. This one is also going to be an integer, and by default, it's going to be 1. And this we're multiplying with the speed multiplier. By default, this one is going to be 1, so it's literally not going to do anything. However, once we have that, we can create another function. Let's call it stop movement. In there, we can get this speed multiplier and set it to 0. So regardless of what the direction or the speed is, we're multiplying everything with 0, so it's always going to be 0. This we can now use inside of the animation player. All we have to do is add a call method track on the character body 2D, and then add a key. And right now it's not visible because I have to save the script. If I now add a key, we can see stop movement. This should be played all the way at the beginning. And now if I run this again, I can shoot at the drone a couple of times. And now it stops moving once it explodes. Righty, with that, we can come to the final part that right now the explosion is just an animation. It doesn't do anything. And let me minimize all of the functions so all of this is a bit easier to see. Now we have to figure out how to make the explosion hurt everything else. Or more specifically, how can the explosion hurt other entities? The best way to get started on that is to open the grenade, because in there we have done something similar. We are checking inside of the grenade if the explosion is active. If that is the case, we're getting all of the targets, and then we cycle through the targets and check if they are in range. And if that is the case, we are going to hit them. Which means inside of the drone, I can do something pretty similar. I want to create another variable that we can call explosion active. This one is going to be a Boolean, which is false by default. And then inside of the process function, if there is a collision, we want to set explosion active to true. And the same thing we want to do inside of hit. So if health is below 0, we want to set explosion active to true as well. That way we know if there's an explosion. And this explosion active is going to stop once we are destroying the node, which happens at the end of the animation player. Which means next up, inside of the process function, we can check if explosion active is the case. And if that is the case, we can get all of the targets. And this is going to be pretty similar compared to what we have done with the grenades. And let me expand all of this. First of all, we want to get the containers and all of the entities. I can literally copy all of that. After we have that, we want to loop through all of that. So for target in targets, we want to check if a target is inside of a range, which is going to be another variable, var in range. For that, I want to get the target and the global position, then distance to the current global position of the drone. If that is below, let's say 400, and there is hit in the target, then I want to call target.hit. All of that, once again, the same thing we have done in there. Although I just realized, right now we are simply declaring a variable. So this shouldn't be like this. We're just declaring a variable. And then on the next line, we are checking if in range and hit in target. That is feeling much better. That means if we are trying all of this now, I can make the drone explode next to the player, and we are subtracting health. On top of that, if I go to the inside level, in there we still have enemies, and I want to add the drone. And let's move the drone to... Where do I have a crate? We have a crate right there. So right now the drone isn't touching anything, which means I can go inside. And if I now go to the crate, it already exploded. And I think I see what the problem here is. If we go back to the drone and we look at the notice area 2D, there we have collision. And right now, this isn't correct. The layer should be on layer 5 and mask should be for layer 1. Although the other problem for this one might be that if we are entering this area, so the notice area, the drone is going to move. And since it is going to explode basically right away, we can't really see the explosion. I guess we could move it. It's going to be a bit hard to test. But if I move it right there and then try to come in from this side, let's try if that is going to work. So now I have to walk for a bit. I'm probably going to speed this up. Right, there we can see the drone, and okay, this is going way too fast. But I'm pretty sure this is going to work, so we can finish this section here. The next enemy I want to work on is going to be the car. That one is going to be a bit different compared to what we have done so far. Most importantly, the car is going to follow a predefined path. It is not going to follow the player. That being said, the car is going to have a turret, and this one is going to point at the player, although only once the player is getting close. On top of that, after a certain amount of time, this turret is going to shoot at the player. If the player is still close after the loading time, there will be some damage. Finally, to indicate the loading of the car gun, there will be some lasers, and those are going to become thicker. Although in practice, all that we are going to do here is draw some lines. That's literally it. Now this might still be a bit confusing, so let me play a video of what all of this is going to look at the end. That should be much clearer. This is what we are going to make. Let's have a look. Here we are back in Godot, and you can see I have closed all of the enemy scenes. There's no more scout, drone, or bug. On top of that, from the outside level, I have gotten rid of the drone. Next up, what I want to do. I want to create a path that the car is going to follow. For that, we have to learn about a new node called Path2D. If you are adding that one, nothing is going to happen. However, if you look at the top, we can now draw a path. You simply click on plus and then you define a path you want to go along. Let me create a couple of points. Something like this. This path I do want to close. Now, when you are at this final stage where you want to click on the final point, you probably don't want to because you would add a point right next to the original point or the starting point. Instead, on the top right, we can close curve. And that is much more exact. Now, this is going to be the path I want the car to follow. But it wouldn't look realistic right now because the car would go like this and then have a sharp curve. That's not the ideal behavior. To round out these curves, you would click on this icon and then you can curve things, and this is what you want to do for all of these points. So let me add it like this. Then we have another curve here and another curve like this. One like this and one something like this. That is going to look much more realistic. So now we have a path. Next up, with this path to be selected, actually, first of all, I want to rename this to car path. With this car path selected, I want to add another node. And this node we can find right below path2D. We want to have a path follow 2D. If I'm creating this one, and this has to be a child of the car path, we are adding one more node. And this node has progress and progress relative, or progress ratio. And if I increase the number, we are moving along this point. This could either be in pixels, or this could be relative, or the ratio. The ratio is what you probably want to use. With that, we have a point that we can control. Basically, what you want to do is to add children to this path follow 2D, and then those are going to follow this path. For example, what we could be doing is add a sprite 2D, and then give it, let me quick load it, the car.png. Now we have a car, and this car can follow this path. We do have to rotate it, but you get the basic idea. Which means, what I want to do next, for now, I want to get rid of this sprite 2D. Also, I want to get rid of this path follow 2D. And instead, what I want to do is to create a whole new scene. The root node for this one has to be a path follow 2D, which I'm going to rename to car. Then I can save all of that under scenes. There we have the enemies. And there I want to have the car scene. Now the car scene is going to get a character body 2D, and let me zoom in quite a bit. The character body 2D obviously is going to need another node, which is going to be a collision shape 2D. Before we can assign this one a shape though, I want to give all of this a sprite 2D, which we can quick load via quick load, and then simply get car main.png. There we have the basic car. You have already seen the problem. This car needs to point to the right. That we can do quite easily. Rotation, 90 degrees, and let's center it around this point. Once we have that, we can give it a collision shape. And I think this shape is too irregular to have a general shape. So I want to get rid of the collision shape and instead add a collision polygon 2D. That allows me to draw a couple of points around it. Doesn't have to be too precise. Something like this. There we go. Now we have a collision shape. This would be the really basic setup for this scene. But now we're getting a warning that for the path follow 2D, we don't have a path 2D. But that isn't really a problem, because the way this is supposed to be used inside of the outside scene with the car path selected, I want to add the car. Now we can see we have the car, and we can move this via the progress ratio. And with that, we are moving around. So this is working perfectly fine. On top of that, what we can do to make all of this even more useful we can give this car node a script. And let me get rid of everything besides the process function. Because ultimately, all I want to do is I want to get the progress ratio of this node. So the path follow 2D always has a progress ratio and a progress. And all I really have to do to move the car is to increase this number, which we can do really easily. All we have to do is increase it by a small amount. In my case, I went with 0.05 and multiply this with delta. What this is allowing us now to do, if I go to the outside level, the car is going to move continuously. And this is going to be a bit hard to see, but if we are waiting, at some point, the car should be driving along here. I hope I'm not missing it. There we go. We have the car, and also the car is moving the player. We might have to move it a bit more slowly, but that's a small detail. What is much more important for now is that all of this is working just fine. So this is basically all you need to move some kind of object along a path. Although this obviously doesn't do very much, so we have to refine things quite a bit more. What I want to work on next is I want to add a node 2D, and this node 2D is going to be the turret. What is really important for this node is that it centers on top of this graphic thing here, because that's the holding thing for the turret. Next up, I want to give the turret a sprite 2D, and this one we can also quick load. We already have it selected. We have car and turret.png. And there we have the turret, which I want to face to the right by default. What this setup allows us to do is to rotate the node 2D via transform, and that way we are also rotating the turret. So that's looking really good. Although, that being said, the turret should only look at the player if the player is nearby, which means we want to add an area 2D, and this area 2D is going to be a notice area. It would technically also be an attack area, but it doesn't really matter, I suppose. Both is fine. For this one, we want to add a collision shape. The collision shape is going to be a circle shape, and this circle shape we want to have with a reasonable size. Something like that. And before I forget, the thing I always forget is the collision layer and mask. The area 2D should be on layer 5 and can only see the player. However, for the character body 2D, for the collision, it shouldn't be on layer 1. This one should be on layer 2 for enemies, and it can see the player, other enemies, and projectiles. Now that we have covered that, I want to connect the area 2D via body entered to the script. On top of that, we want to have a second signal for body exited. And the way we are going to use them is via a variable player near, which is a boolean that by default is false. And then, once again, if the player is entering the area, player near will be true. And if the player is exiting this area, the variable will be false. So far, all of this should be really straightforward. I don't think this is difficult at this point anymore. Finally, inside of process, I want to check if the player is near. And if that is the case, I want to get the turret. And I want to make sure that the turret is looking at the global's position of the player. And while we are testing all of this, I'm going to set the car speed to something really slow so we can actually find it. Now with that, let's try the outside scene. And if I go down a bit, the car should be here somewhere. There we go. And now if I get close enough, the gun is going to look at the player. It's looking really good. Perfect. Next up, before we continue back inside of the car, I want to add an underscore to the notice area body entered or exited. That way Godot stops complaining. For the next part, I want it so that the car can shoot at the player. And this is what I explained in the beginning. I basically want the car to load the guns or the lasers for a second or two, and only at the end of this loading time, the player actually gets damaged if the player is still close to the car. For that sort of thing, with the car selected, I want to start by first zooming in and then inside of the turret. I want to add another node. And that node is going to be a raycast 2D. That is an entirely new node. And what this one is doing, you can kind of see it inside of the editor. A raycast 2D, in the most basic sense, is an arrow that you can move in a certain direction, so you can update the direction and the length. Also, you can update the starting position. But first of all, for the notice area 2D, I want to move all of that behind the turret. That way it's not in the way anymore. And now we can cover the raycast and move it in front of the gun to something like this. And if you look at the inspector, you can see we have enabled, exclude parent, and then target position. Target position is basically the distance from the origin. And in my case, we could set this to 200 to move it a bit further out. Although what I actually want to do is to line this raycast 2D to the end of the area. And it should be a straight line, so no Y, and in my case, X is 520. Although if your notice area is larger, this number would also become larger. Now, what does this raycast actually do? Number one, you can use it to detect any kind of object. The way you would do that, if I go to the script, I could, for example, print the raycast 2D, and on there, we can get a collider. This collider, if it doesn't collide with anything, is going to be empty. But once it collides with something, it is going to give you the object it collided with. So with the outside scene selected, if I now run all of this, we get object null, because the collider of the raycast is not doing anything, but there it's colliding with the player. So we're getting the player. Now this kind of thing can be incredibly useful for a couple of different scenarios. Where you see it the most is if you have a gun, like a first-person shooter gun, where you don't see the projectiles. You could use that system to check if the player was looking at the target while the trigger was pressed. And you can use it for lots of other scenarios. Although in my case, this is not actually what I want to do. Instead, back in the car, I want to add one more node. And that is going to be a line 2D. A line 2D, if I go back to the 2D editor, is just going to be a line. So with line 2D selected, I can literally just draw a couple of points and then have a line. I could also change the color to whatever I want, and I could change the line thickness. I know, 50. There are a few more things you can do in here, for example, a fill color, capping, but I don't really care about any of this. And in fact, I want to reverse everything. So now we are back to the starting position. What I want to do is to make this line 2D follow the same positions as the raycast 2D. That we can do in a couple of different ways. For example, for the first line, we could simply draw a point on the original and make sure it aligns, and then you can draw another point all the way at the end. And once again, make sure that those two are aligning. That looks about right. With that, we would have one laser that right now is a bit wide, so let's reduce the width to a 1. Also, I want to update the color to something a bit more reddish. So I want to go to a red color that I guess could look a tiny bit purple, and then reduce the opacity. And now this is looking about right. What this allows us to do inside of the game, if I run all of this and find the car once again, there you can see we already have a faint line. And this we can make thicker or thinner as we want. What you could also do for the second laser, I want to add another raycast, so raycast 2D, and this one is going to get a line 2D as well. Now, first of all, for the raycast, we have to move it to the starting position, so where the gun is starting there. And then for the target position, Y should be 0 and X should be 520. That way, the two lasers are identical. The only difference between them is the starting position. From there, what I want to do first of all is to copy the color of the first line 2D and simply paste it in there. Also, the line width should be identical. That is going to give us a line with the same width and color, but we don't have the actual points. Now for that, I only want to draw in the starting point. So this line 2D is going to get a starting point on the same position. But the target point I want to add via code, which is also really easily done. I want to go to the code, and there I want to run something inside of the ready function. I basically want to target the second line and then add a point via a method. For that though, first of all, I have to get both lines. And since I later on want to reuse them, I'm going to add both of them in the global scope of this class with onReady. I want to have line 1, which has to be a line 2D, and the actual value is going to be something we can drag in. This we can now duplicate, and this is line 2, which we get from turret, raycast 2D2, and then line 2D in there. With that, inside of the ready function, I want to get line 2 and simply add a point. The point we want to get is what we're getting from the raycast 2D2. Specifically, we want to get the target position. That is all we need for this one. If I now go back to the outside level and find the car, we should be having 2 lasers with the right starting position, and that's looking really good. Perfect. Add point is a really common method that you see on line 2D. It lets you add more points. It should be fairly straightforward. You could be adding more and more points here if you want to have more complex shapes. Although in my case, I don't really want to have that. Instead, what I want to do is I want to minimize the turret and instead add an animation layer. On this animation player, we're going to add a new animation, and let's call it laser load. This laser load is going to do 2 major things. First of all, we get a property track, and on there, we want to have line 2D. The thing I want to animate is going to be the width of it. The way this is going to work is, first of all, the entirety of the animation should be 2 seconds. And the start value, if I add a key in there, is always going to be 0. This we want to keep until second 1 and then up to second 1.9, by which point we want to have a width or a value of the laser that is 10 pixels. Really important then, at 2 seconds, I want to add another key. And this key is going to get a value of 0. What all of this is going to do is, we start with a width of 0, so the laser isn't visible at all. And this we keep up to 1 second. Then we're going to actually load the laser, and on this keyframe at 1.9 seconds, we're going to shoot the gun, which should disable the laser lines. Which means on the next keyframe at 2 seconds, we don't want to have lasers anymore. Then we can restart the entire thing right away, and for the first second, we don't get any laser. So it looks like the gun doesn't do anything for a bit. All of this we want to play once the player has entered the notice area, which means I want to get the animation player inside of onNotice area player 2D, and in there I want to play laser load. Now with the outside level selected, let's try all of this. And there we can see we have at least 1 animation. It doesn't loop right now, so we can only see it once, but that we can fix quite easily by enabling the looping. Next up, I want to add another property track with the other line 2D, and this one we also want to work on the width, and for that I literally want to copy all of this. So this shouldn't be too difficult. I want to have a key there with a value of 10, and then finally at the end of the animation, the value should once again be 0. I can now go back to the outside level and test all of this. And we get something, but there has been a mistake. Although it doesn't look terrible. And the mistake is, for this value, we have 1 pixel for the width, and for this value, we also have 1 pixel. That should fix all of that. If I now approach the car, we get both of the lasers. That's feeling much better. Perfect. With that in place, there's one more thing that I do want to do. The car should have, let's do it all the way at the top. I want to have a fire function. doesn't need any parameters, and all that this one is going to do. At least in the most basic sense, we want to have globals, then get the health of the player, and subtract it by, let's say, 20. The car should pack a punch. This we can then use inside of the animation. I want to add a call method track on the car itself. And there, all the way, once we are shooting the laser, so at 1.9 seconds, I want to call the fire method. Let's try all of that. So if I now move close to the car, we get the lasers, and once we get hit, we are losing health. That's working just fine. Perfect. That means we are nearly done. There are just some smaller things we have to work out. This can be an exercise. There are two things I want you guys to work on. Number one, there should be a fire animation on the gun nozzle once the gun was shot. You can do all of this either via the animation player or via tweens. Both would be perfectly fine. Inside of graphics, if you look at the explosion folder, there's a gun.png file. This is what I have used, but you can use whatever you want in here. Besides that, if the player is leaving the notice area before the laser has been loading, I want you guys to unload the laser, meaning the width should go back to 0 from whatever current position it has. Pause the video now and try to figure all of this out. I want to start with the gun nozzle animation, and for that, I want to add a sprite 2D, and I can minimize the raycast. Instead, on the texture, I want to go graphics, there we have explosions, and there we have gun.png. This I want to drag into the texture, and we have to use transform to align it properly. Do something like this. And that graphic is definitely way too large. Let's scale it down to 0.6. Looks about right. And I want to place it here-ish. Then I can duplicate it and move it straight down to the other gun. Just so that we have proper naming, I want to rename it to Gunfire 1 and Gunfire 2. Those two I now want to animate. This could happen with the animation player or with tweens. And I'm going to go with tweens because the animation here really isn't going to be too complicated. The way this is going to work. When we are starting the scene, I want to make both of these gunfires invisible, which I'm going to do with modulate. Both of those should have an alpha value of 0. So alpha for both of them is going to be 0. Then inside of the code, once we are running the fire method, I want to update the alpha values. Although, since I am going to reference these nodes a couple of times, I want to store them in a separate variable, which we are once again going to do with onReadyVar Gunfire1 is sprite 2D, which is going to be Gunfire 1. Then we can duplicate all of this with Gunfire 2 and Gunfire 2. As soon as we are calling the fire function, I want to get the Gunfire 1, get the modulate, and on there, I want to have the alpha value, which should be a 1. That way, we can see both of the fire animations. Let's try all of that. I want to run the outside level and find the car. And now, after one shot, we can see the fire animation. This one has worked perfectly fine. Although now, we want to hide these once again. For that, I'm going to use a tween, which we create with create tween, and then I want to tween a property. I am going to start with Gunfire 1. The property I want to work on is modulate, and inside of there, I want to have the alpha value. The starting value should be 0. Finally, I need a duration. Now the duration we could set to something like 0.4, which would be perfectly fine. That being said though, we could randomize this a tiny bit, which we do with randf range, and I want to have a random value between 0.1 and 0.5. Also, let me expand all of this a bit more. Now we can see the entire line. This line I can now duplicate because I want to do pretty much the same thing for Gunfire 2. Although at the moment, we're going to play both of these tween properties in sequence, which I don't want, so I'm going to get tween and then set parallel to true. With that, I can go back to outside, run the scene, and the gunfire should disappear. So after 1 second, we are getting the gunfire disappearing. This is looking pretty cool. Perfect. That is going to cover the first part of the exercise. Next up, if the player is moving out of the notice area, meaning this function here is true, then I want to stop the animation and return the lasers to an invisible state. For that, I want to animate the width of both of the lines. They should simply go from whatever current value they have back to 0. All of that isn't too difficult. First of all, if the player moves outside of the notice area, I want to get the animation player and stop the current animation. Next up, I want to create a tween once again with create tween. This tween, since we have 2 lasers, should be played in parallel. So set parallel true. Next up then, I want to get the tween and tween a property. The node I want to work with would be line 1. The property would be the width. The target value is going to be 0. And finally, for the duration, I once again want to get rand f range with 0.1 and 0.5. All of this I can duplicate because line 2 is going to work in pretty much the same way. With that, I can run the outside level again. And now, if we get hit, this works still fine. But if I move outside, okay, this is kind of hard to do, but that one didn't work. And I think I know the reason. When we are stopping the animation, we are setting the width to 0 right away. Meaning we don't want to stop it, we just want to pause the animation. If we are now trying all of this, I once again have to find the car, and there we have the full animation. And if okay, this almost works. The issue right now is that once the player is exiting this area, we are pausing the animation, and then we are hiding the lasers. However, once the player enters the area once again, then we don't start from the beginning of the animation, we start from the pause point. To fix that, all the way at the end, I want to get the animation player and then stop the animation. Although this we only want to do once the tween has finished. That we get with await, tween, and then is finished. Just finished. Now all of this should work just fine. I can try it one more time, and now we get the car moving slowly by. We get one shoot animation, and if we move outside, it disappears. If we move back inside, we get the same thing. So this is working really good. Cool. And this also covers a huge amount of extra nodes. We have learned about a raycast and align 2D. And before we finish, I want to increase the speed of the car to 0.2. I think that's a good middle ground. 0.5 probably is a bit too fast. Next up, we're going to create the hunter. This one is going to cover 2 more advanced topics. Number 1 is pathfinding, number 2 is bone animations. Both of these are going to be their own section. And let's get started with pathfinding. So far, we moved all of the enemies towards the player or along a predefined path. All of that is really simple enemy behavior. All of that can be a good start, but for a really good feeling game, you want to have something more advanced. And one of the key steps towards smarter enemies is to have proper pathfinding. What I mean when I talk about pathfinding, if I just draw a couple of obstacles, so here we have a couple of obstacles that nobody can walk through. And at the end, we have the player. At the beginning, we have the enemies. So far, we always move the enemies simply towards the player. This is fine, but once we have an obstacle, in this example, this line, the enemy would simply stop moving at this point, which doesn't feel very smart. Something that would be much more intelligent would be to have the enemy walk around these obstacles and then move towards the player. And that is what we are implementing with pathfinding. It's not terribly difficult to implement in Godot, although first of all, we have to create a more interesting outside level. Otherwise, there's no point to pathfinding. Let's start with that. Back in Godot, the outside level does have a couple of elements, but is ultimately fairly boring. And well, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed up the video and add lots more elements. We are not going to create anything new, and pretty much all that we are going to do is happening inside of ground. In there, we are adding a few more elements, and this is going to, in the end, have a similar complexity compared to what we have done inside of the inside level. If you are coding along and you have a roughly similar outside level, I would also recommend you to spend a bit of time to refining all of this. Most importantly, you want to have lots of walls, these walls that nobody can collide with. Because when we have pathfinding, we want to have a level that is a bit more difficult to navigate. I'm going to emphasize that quite a bit. Alright, at this point I have added a ton of elements. On top of that, inside of the house, I have also added lots more stuff, so it looks a bit nicer. There is a tiny bit more that I have to do, because I have added lots of infestations. They need collision shapes. All of the walls are part of the same tile map, so those still have the collision shape. Which means inside of infestation, I want to add a static body 2D. And this one is going to get a collision polygon 2D. And this I'm going to use to draw a shape around this stuff. This really doesn't have to be too precise, although don't forget, you want to have collisions, and those collisions can be for the player, the enemies, and the projectiles. And this should be the other way around, like so. This I want to copy then, because next up I want to have a shape around there. This one's still just fine. And then one shape around these two dots. And something like this. The rest is looking moderately okay, although we do have a bit of an issue. And that is that the player could simply move outside of this bit and outside of this bit, and then literally just leave the entire level. For that, I am going to add, if I minimize everything, I want to add another node 2D. This node 2D is going to be a level barrier, or rather level barriers. And there, really all we have to do is add 2 more static bodies. They both are going to get a collision shape, and this collision shape is just going to be a rectangle shape. This one right now is in the center of the level. If I make it a bit larger, then we can move it around easily. And I basically want to move it here. The actual size doesn't matter so much. The one thing I care about is that it makes it impossible for the player to leave the level. Although for that, we have to put this on layer 5, and it can only see the player. That way, we have the car not collide with it. That's quite important. The same thing we want to do for the bottom. So I want to copy this static body 2D, or rather move the collision shape and move it to this bottom bit. I guess this entire area here should be covered. For that, I want to have another static body 2D with a collision shape. This one, once again, is going to be a rectangle shape that we have to move around. Let's place it here. Also, I just realized, since I copied this static body 2D, the size of this collision shape and this collision shape are linked, meaning if I resize one, we are resizing the other. Which is a bit of an annoying behavior, but you can get rid of it by simply deleting one of the collision shapes and then adding a new one. So collision shape 2D, this one once again has to be a rectangle shape 2D, and this one I want to extend and move it in the right position. That's looking good. Now this static body 2D has the right collision, this one has also the right collision, and the final one needs to be updated. And now we are good to go. There's just one more bit, and that's this area here. Although for that, there's one more thing that we are missing in the main level, and that is all of the crates. So far, for example, for the inside level, all of the crates are inside of the ground node. I think I placed them. So somewhere in there, we have all of the crates, which may not be the best organization, but I'm going to follow the same pattern. Which means inside of ground, I want to add crate, and this crate I can now move around. And for this one, I simply want to have 2 crates there blocking this part. And then I need to have a few more crates all over this level. So there's a bit for the player to pick up. All right, with that, we have a respectable outside level. Let's try all of that. And I didn't want to do that. Inside of the outside level, I guess we should have more steam vents, but generally everything seems to be working just fine, and we cannot leave this bit. Now this isn't terribly realistic, but I guess for now this is fine. This part also still works, and the camera is zooming out. And now, if I go all the way to the right, we have lots of stuff here, which is working just fine. So I am quite happy with that. Finally, the one last thing that I do want to do is the steam vent. We want to have a few more times, simply because it's kind of a cool effect. I know we could put it somewhere here. All right, with that, we have a proper outside level that is getting really, really complex. With that, we can work on another node. But first of all, I want to close everything that we don't need. We also don't need the inside level. And we can actually also close the player. So right now, I only have the outside level. Next up, I want to create a new scene. And this new scene is going to have a root node of a character body 2D, which I'm going to rename right away to Hunter. That we are going to save inside of enemies. And in there, we now have an empty scene. This one, as always, is going to get a sprite, and we're going to add a collision shape 2D. For that, inside of enemies, we have Hunter, and there we have hunter.png. This is going to be the texture for the sprite 2D. So I can just drag it in there. And now we have a huge graphic like we had for the bug. This is way too large, so let's scale it down to 0.3. Still a bit large, 0.2. I do want this to be quite large, but not too large. So I guess even 0.15. So if you look at this, this thing is going to cover about half of the window. Maybe more like a third. So this is definitely quite large. For this one, for the collision shape, I once again want to have a capsule shape. Although, I almost forgot, the standard orientation should be to the right. So this needs to be rotated by 90 degrees. Same for the collision capsule, 90-degree rotation. And now we can roughly cover the body of this thing. Let's place this one into the level. So with the enemy selected, I want to add the Hunter. This Hunter, I now want to move away from the origin point so I can easily grab it. And then we want to place him, I don't know, somewhere here. Also, what I keep on forgetting is the collision shapes. This one is going to be an enemy, and he can collide with the player, other enemies, and the rest of the level. Also, he should be able to collide with objects. At this point, I think I actually made a mistake that all of the enemies need to be able to see the objects as well. I'm not sure if I added that to all of them. Let me quick check. So the bug needs to see mask number 3. So So this is important. Next up, the drone. This one can see mask number 3. And finally, we have the scout, although this one doesn't really matter because he cannot move. Okay, small mistake, but not too much of an issue. So now we have to figure out how to make this hunter move towards the player. Right now, the hunter doesn't do anything. And I want to start by doing the usual. So this one is going to get an area 2D, which I will rename to notice area. Then we are going to add a collision shape 2D, which is going to get a circle shape that is, I don't know, some size. Choose whatever you like. Besides that, while we're here, I also want to add another area 2D for the attack area. And this one is going to get a collision shape as well. Also a circle shape, and this one has to be a bit smaller. Something like this. After that, we can give the hunter a script. All of this stuff is perfectly fine. Var active, which is a Boolean, which by default is going to be false. And then, with the notice area selected, we want to send the signal that if the player has entered, I want to set active to true. While we're here, we can also add the other signal for body exited. That is the case, active should be false. Now, if this hunter is active, I want to use the process function and move it, which means I want to have move and slide. And before that, I need to have a velocity. How can we get that? And let me comment it out because this is going to be a larger answer. In the most basic sense, what we are going to get, if this is the starting position of the bug and this is the target position, so the player, we are expecting a couple of obstacles. I know, let's play one here and one there. And we want to get some kind of path so that the hunter moves around those. This path is defined by a couple of points. We have 1 point there, 1 point there, another point there, 1 point there, and then the final point. Essentially what we are going to do is we are going to move this hunter along all of these points, which means we're going to get the velocity from the current position and the next position on the path. This is going to give us a direction. Although for all of that, we have to get the path first of all, which we are getting via 2 nodes. Although before we get to that, Godot is complaining once again, so we have to add some underscores. I really don't like it when we have warnings in the outside level. I want to add a node called navigation region 2D. If you are adding this one, not much is going to happen. For something to happen, you have to create a navigation polygon. And once you have that, you can simply draw in an area where you want to have navigation. For example, one area could be this bit, and you don't have to be too precise for the area, but you want to put a bit of work in there. So I want to have an area that looks something like this. Suppose we can stop down here and then return to the beginning. Something like this. This is giving us one region where we have pathfinding available, which means for now, I want to move the hunter into this area. The actual position doesn't really matter. This is looking about right. And to make all of this a bit more visible, I'm going to give the hunter a larger notice area. That way, it's a bit more visible that he is going to follow us. Next up, inside of the hunter, we will need one more node. That is called a navigation agent 2D. This one can navigate inside of a navigation region. That part should be fairly straightforward. This we can now use inside of the hunter script, and I want to start by creating a ready function. We will have to get the navigation agent 2D, and this one wants to have a target position. The target position in our case is going to be the player, which means we want to have globals and player position. Once we have that, we actually are going to get a path. That we can print right away. I want to get the navigation agent 2D. On there, I want to get the current navigation path. Right now, this isn't going to work. So if I run the script, all we are getting is an empty array. Doesn't do very much. The reason why that is, if you click with Control on this node, you get the documentation, and in there, we get a node. After setting target position, something we have already done, it is required to get the next path position. And this has to be a function once every physics frame to update the internal path logic of the navigation agent. So what does that mean? When we talk about physics in Godot, there's one really important thing to understand, and that is that effectively we have two separate frame rates. The one we have worked with so far is the visible frames. And those are the frames Godot is generating to display whatever kind of game you have. For these, Godot is trying to generate as many frames as possible. If you have a simple game and a powerful computer, you might get over 1,000 frames per second. However, besides that, we also have physics frames, and those are locked to 60 frames per second. They never go faster or slower, at least ideally. If the computer is too slow or the game too complex, this can dip below 60 frames per second. If that is happening, you have a major problem in your game. But for now, the major thing you have to understand is that we have visible frames and physics frames. And inside of the physics frames, you have a ton of calculations. And those calculations include pathfinding. Now, this isn't too important at this stage. Once you make more physically demanding games, you would have to think about it more. So far, though, the only place where this really matters is that we have a process function, and this tries to run as fast as possible, meaning as many frames as Godot can create. Besides that, we have another function called physics process. This physics process does the same thing as process, so it runs on basically every frame, except the frames here are the physics frames, meaning this is always trying to run at 60 frames per second. Once you're doing something that involves more physics, you want to use this function. And let's do it for this hunter. I want to use move and slide in there and get rid of the original process. Now we have a move and slide, and we still want to get a velocity. The velocity is going to be a product of a direction and a speed. Speed, we simply can set as a constant, so var speed going to be an integer, let's say 200. The direction is the much more important bit. That we want to create in a separate variable, which has to be a vector 2. And this vector 2 is going to be a target position, and from that we want to subtract the global position of the current scene, or rather of this particular node. This is going to return a vector, which we want to normalize. Next up, we have to get this target. Although a much better name for this one would be the next path position. That is effectively what we are trying to get. This one also has to be a vector 2. And we are getting it with the navigation agent 2D and get next path position. Once we have that, we have the actual path. Although, at least for now, I do not actually want to move the enemy because that might get confusing. Instead, I simply want to print after get next path position, I want to print the entire current navigation path. If I now run the game, we get a whole bunch of output. So if I look at the output, we are getting an array. The first one is empty because we haven't called the first process yet. So on the first line, this isn't really going to work. But in our case, this doesn't matter so much. If this is a major problem for you and you have to call physics on the very first frame, you want to use call deferred. I have covered that a while back, so just check your notes. What we rather care about is any of these arrays. Although what is even better to visualize all of this is you can go to debug, and there you can have visible navigation. This you can then use along with the navigation agent. We have debug, and we can enable it. If we now run the game, we can see a red line. This is the navigation for the monster. And I realized this is not ideal because the player can't go through there. But we can fix that in just a second. So let me walk around it. This red line is the navigation that the monster would be following. And there we go. We are starting at the monster, and we would have gone to the player. The issue is, inside of outside, the player doesn't actually reach this area. But that we can fix quite easily. All I have to do is to extend this navigation region and make it cover up to, let's say, this point here. Seems like a good break bit. Also, while we are here, this crate should be a bit further to the right. That way the player can move through this bit. Okay, now let's try all of this again. And this is working reasonably well. Now the monster is walking towards the player. And you can see we have one red line that goes all the way towards the player, starting from the enemy. And it's always trying to get the shortest path. That information we can now use inside of the script, and let me maximize this window. We have the next path position, and from that we are getting a direction. And once this path is being reached, we are getting a new next path, which means all we have to do is to uncomment move and slide, and then we can run all of this. And now the monster should be moving towards the player. And I don't think he's terribly fast. There we go. Now, the issue we have right now is that we are not updating the path once the player has been moving. Also, this area might be too small for the monster. But, well, you get the idea. We now have a path that the monster is going to follow. However, it doesn't update for the new position of the player. Also, let me add an underscore to delta, otherwise Godot is being annoying again. Essentially, what we now have to figure out is how to call this target position to get a new path basically as often as we can. But here you have to be really careful. Creating a new path is quite hardware intensive, meaning you don't want to do this as often as you can. You only want to do it every so often. In my case, I'm going to create a timer. Actually, let's create a node that we are going to call timers, and this one is going to get one timer, and let's call it the navigation timer. This we want to connect to timeout, so connect in there, and then in the inspector for this navigation timer, wait time we could set to 1 second, and auto start should be enabled. However, one shot should not be enabled. And then inside of this navigation timer, we want to get this target position. What this is now going to do, if I run the entire game again, after 2 seconds, we get a new updated position, and there we go. This feels much more precise. So every 2 seconds, we are calculating a new position towards the player. And that way, the monster is going to follow us. And if I move a bit further away, you can see that this is still working just fine. So around the corner, there we have a new path. This is working perfectly fine. Although this, we still want to qualify a tiny bit. We don't want to do this all the time. Instead, we only want to do it if the hunter is active. Although I think a much better experience for the game is to make the hunter active with a pretty large notice area. That way, he can come out of nowhere. Let's have a look at that in the outside level. And I think this is a reasonably large area. What we can also do before we continue, we can make the bug or the hunter look at the Godolooo builds and player position. But this, once again, we only want to do if the bug is active. Otherwise, there's not really any point to it. As a matter of fact, we can do all of this only if the hunter is active. Let's try it now. And there we still have the path, and the bug is moving towards us. So that's looking pretty good. The final thing we have to work on for this bit is that at the moment we only have a small part of the level being covered by the pathfinding. So what can we do to expand this? And well, you could just draw one shape that is incredibly complex, which would be possible, but also really difficult to work with because you have so many intricate shapes. This would be a bit annoying to deal with. Instead, what you can do is simply draw multiple shapes, and this works just fine. You can draw as many shapes as you want. So let me draw, let's say, one roughly for this bit, and then I can close the area. This is going to work, but we have to make one more refinement. So if I run the game again, you can still see the red dot, and the hunter is going to find me. But if I now go to this area, it's not working anymore. So what went wrong here? The issue is that when you have two areas, they have to be connected perfectly. They cannot overlap, and they cannot have a gap between them. Which means what you want to do is zoom in very closely and then connect these dots. And let me add another point for this one and then move it all the way to this part here. That's looking good. With that, it looks like we have one collision shape. Let's try it now. And if I go to the second area, we once again get a proper pathfinding. So this is much better. And well, at this point, we just have to draw a couple more shapes to finish off this part, which is going to be your kind of exercise. I guess for this video, we covered a bit more advanced stuff, so there isn't really much we can practice. But draw in the rest of the area, and then we are done for this bit. Alright, that was quite a bit of work, but I believe now the level is all done. So we get the red dot that is following us, and let's try it here again. That looks pretty good. So I think for this part, we are good. Now we have one enemy with pathfinding. For this part, I'm going to talk about skeleton animations. You can animate an object in Godot or in general in a couple of different ways. You could simply change the position or the rotation or even the scale. This is something we have done for the player and for the drone. You could also place several images in sequence. This is what we have done for the bug or for the explosion. Those two are fairly easy to work with, but they also have their limitations. Position and rotation are basic properties that don't do very much. And playing images in a sequence limits you to only the images that you already have. Which is fine for most basic animations, but sometimes you do want to have something more flexible. And for that, we have skeleton animations. They take apart an object and then you animate every individual parts. And all of this you do via a skeleton. That being said, the basic idea of a skeleton animation is that you rotate the body parts around a focal point. This is something we can already achieve with sprites and the rotate property. Unfortunately, that would be incredibly difficult to work with. A complex skeleton simply has way too many parts to make this feasible. Instead, there is a whole skeleton system that we are going to explore in this part, and this makes all of this significantly easier. Basically, you specify in the end a target point, and then Godot calculates all of the rotations. Let's have a look at that. Back in Godot, inside of the hunter scene, at the moment we have a single image of a bug. Also, let me hide all of the notice areas and the collision shape, so we just have the bug. At the moment, this bug is a single sprite 2D. It cannot be animated besides position, rotation, scale, and skew, which do give us some options, but it's ultimately fairly limited. Because of that, I want to get rid of this sprite 2D right away. And instead, let me explain what I want to do. First of all, I want to add a sprite 2D, which could, for example, be the torso. And then inside of graphics, if you go to enemies and hunter, there we have the hunter.png. This is the entirety of the bug. Besides that though, we also have the body parts. So these are all of the individual body parts of the hunter. Right now, I want to work with torso.png. I can drag it in there, and this would be a torso. I want to move this a bit further to the right, so it's centered. Next up, I want to create another node, which can just be a node 2D. That one I want to rename to right front shoulder. This right front shoulder is going to be this position here, and then I'm going to add another sprite 2D as a child, which is going to be the leg front inner, this one here. I can add it and then put it in roughly the right position. What this kind of system allows us to do is in the right front shoulder, we can use transform and then rotate this child around it. And this you could animate with an animation player, and if you go even further, you could add another joint around here for the main claw and then rotate this one as well. That way, simply via using rotate, you could create a really complex animation. Unfortunately though, this would be incredibly annoying to work with, so let's not do that. Instead, Godot has an entire system for it. It's called a skeleton 2D. This skeleton 2D is supposed to take care of all of the rotations as long as you give it a point to rotate around. And this is always going to sound a bit confusing when we get started, so let's just create one arm and then it's going to make much more sense. First of all though, the torso is going to be one child of this skeleton 2D. Besides that, I want to add another child, which is a bone 2D. This bone 2D has to be a child of the skeleton 2. And you can see we have a thing. This is supposed to be one bone. And if you have it selected and expand the inspector, you can set a rest position. What is a bit more interesting for now is you can calculate the length and the angle. The default here is that Godot is taking care of that. Although you could disable that and then create a bone with any kind of length and any kind of direction. For example, we could have something like this. Although this isn't what I want to do. Usually, you want to have Godot calculate the length and the angle of all of the bones. Because the way you are supposed to use this is by giving this bone another child bone. And this has to be a child. And once you move the child, Godot calculates the length and the size of the bone relative to the child bone. And right now, I want to create a front right leg. So let me rename things. The first bone is going to be the torso. And the second bone is going to be the front right leg. Also, the torso sprite should be a child of the torso bone. That way, things make a bit more sense. Also, let's put it there. That feels better. Now we have a front right leg. This also needs a sprite 2D with the leg front inner. We can simply move it to the right position, roughly here. You can specify this later on a bit better. And now we have that. I want to add another bone 2D as a child of front right leg. This I also want to rename to front right claw. This front right claw is going to be all the way at the end at the final joint. Roughly here. After we have that, I want to add a final sprite 2D for this side, which is going to be the leg front outer. I can add this one, and now we can put this roughly in this position. With that, we are getting one of the legs of the hunter. And for the final bone, since we don't have another child bone, the size of this bone is very, very small. And for this kind of situation, you could extend it so it covers the size of this bone. Although you don't actually have to. But it feels much better. So now we have one arm. And this arm we want to rotate, or rather control, via one target node, which is just going to be a position. Which means with the hunter selected, I want to add a node 2D that is going to be renamed to targets. And in there, I want to add a couple of marker 2Ds. The only one we have for now is going to be for the front right. And this I want to move to this position here, all the way at the end of the claw. What is actually going to make the entire system work? If I go to Skeleton 2D, I can add a modification stack. This is going to be the only option in there, and in there you can add more modifications. There's one element I want to add, and now if I click on empty again, we get different kinds of skeleton modifications that we could add. The one I care about for now is a 2-bone IK. If I click on that one, we have to specify 3 main things. A target node path, a joint 1 bone, and a joint 2 bone. The target node is going to be our front right marker. The joint 1 bone is going to be the front right leg, and joint 2 bone is going to be the outer part, so front right claw. If I add that, nothing is going to happen because we haven't enabled this modification. If we do that, this skeleton or this part of the skeleton becomes yellow. And more importantly, if you are moving this point, you are using it to rotate everything. Although right now, this is looking really weird. That is because inside of the skeleton modification, the bend direction is wrong. If you enable that one, this is looking much better. So now we have one part of the animation. And this is the idea. Now we can see it much better. We have this one point, front right. And Godot tries to calculate some kind of rotation so that we get an actual joint. And I hope this system makes sense once you actually see it. It feels really good, and this is very easy to animate. Let's do another bone. I can minimize all of the front right leg. Then with the torso selected, I want to add another bone 2D. This bone 2D is going to be the front left leg. This we want to move to the right position, and for that, the targets should be locked entirely. That way we don't select them by accident, and the front left leg should be here. Then we can give it a sprite 2D as a child, which is going to be the leg front inner. Place it in there. And this we have to rotate, or rather flip on the horizontal axis, which we do by setting the scale X to -1, and then we can re-enable the link properties for the scale. Now we have a flipped inner leg, and after we have that, we can add one more bone 2D, which is going to be the front left claw. Once again, this is going to get a sprite 2D with the leg front outer, which we also have to flip. So X should be -1. And then we can move it in the right position, about here. Also, I forgot, the skeleton should start at this point, and then we can reposition the sprite. Finally, for the front claw, I want to disable autocalculate and make it so that it roughly aligns with the front claw. That looks about right. And next up, we can add another target. Meaning inside of targets, I want to add another marker 2D, and this is going to be the front left target. To move this one, we have to make it so we can select it, and now we can move it to the outer part of the left claw. With that, we can go back to the skeleton 2D, and first of all, what you can also do, inside of resource of the first element, you can give this one a name. For example, this one would be the front right leg. If you now minimize it, you get front right leg. That's much easier to understand. Then I want to add another element. This should be a 2-bone IK, and in there, I have to assign a couple of elements. First of all, the target is front left. Then joint 1 bone should be the front left leg, and joint 2 bone should be the front left claw. And now once we have all of that, I can move this point, and something went wrong here once again. You get this kind of behavior kind of often when you're working with skeletons. If that happens, you want to select front left leg, and then disable and enable autocalculate, and that usually fixes it. So there we go, this is much better. Now we have 2 of the body parts. Next up then, we could, on the torso bone, add another bone 2D, which should be for the head. So once again, I want to make it so we can't select the targets, and now I want to position a head. This head is going to get a sprite 2D as well, and the sprite 2D we need is for the head. And we can place this roughly here, and then reassign the size of the bone and the direction. This should be -90 degrees. You could also work with this part of the skeleton, although I'm going to keep it static. But inside of skeleton 2D, you can add a whole bunch of modifications. For example, you could make a skeleton look at a certain thing, or you could jiggle it. If you play around with the skeleton, there's a ton of stuff you can do, but I want to keep it simple. We are only going to use 2 bone IK, and the head we're not going to move at all. Instead, I want to add 2 more body parts, the 2 back legs. Those are going to be your exercise. Add the back legs of the hunter, so there should be 2 sides of this, and pause the video now and see how far you get. Once again, with the torso selected, I want to add another bone 2D. This bone 2D is going to be the back right leg, and on there we're going to add a sprite 2D, which we get from leg back inner. This I want to add there, then place it in the right position. Actually, I just forgot. We first of all have to move this thing to the right point about here, and then we can move the child, or the sprite 2D rather. Once we have that, we can add another bone 2D, which we have to move to the right position here-ish, and then rename it to back right claw. Once again, this one is going to get a sprite 2D with leg back inner. Then we can position this one. And finally, the right back claw, I want to modify a bit so we are covering the entire size. That looks good. Next up, before I create the targets, I want to create the other side of the leg. So this bone 2D is going to go to this side, and we can rename it to back left leg. On there, we are once again going to add a sprite, which is going to be the leg back inner. This we have to flip on the horizontal axis, so -1, and place it in there. After that, we can add another bone 2D, which we have to move to the outer part of all of this, and then rename it as well, back left claw. Finally, on that, I want to add another sprite 2D, which is going to be the leg back outer, which has to be flipped. And then for the last bit, we are nearly done with this part. I want to scale up this thing and move it there-ish. Cool. With that, we have the entirety of the skeleton. Next up, we have to update the targets. For that, I want to add another marker 2D and duplicate this one, because the first one is going to be the back left, and then we have a back right. Back left is going to be in the back left. This is back right. This should be here. And then back left should be here-ish. For the targets, you don't have to be too precise, but you do want to have some reasonably good looking system. It makes it much easier to work with. Okay, with all of that, I can go back to the skeleton, and I want to create another 2-bone IK. The first one is going to be for the right side of the back, so back right. The first, or the inner bone, is going to be the back right leg, and the outer bone is going to be the back right claw. Once you have that, we can move something, and this doesn't look ideal yet. So once again, with the skeleton selected, you can always try to flip the direction if that makes a difference, and it doesn't. So instead, let me try to calculate this side, and that is feeling better. I guess this looks reasonably okay. This is the kind of part, if you have an actual game, you want to spend a ton of time on. Once you have it though, it is an incredibly powerful system. Final part, although first of all, I want to rename a few things. So this part was the front left leg, and this part that we have just done was the back right leg. We need one more element, which is once again going to be a 2-bone IK. The target is going to be the back left. Joint 1 bone is going to be the back left leg. And finally, the target position, the second bone, is going to be the back left claw. Once again, we get some weird thing, and that you can fix by disabling and enabling the auto-calculate, and with that, we get, I think the joint is going in the wrong direction. That we can fix quite easily with this button, and now we get a better behavior. This can look a bit janky, especially if you only spent a few minutes on it. But I think for this part, this is all right. Finally now, I want to rename this final bit so I keep everything organized. This should be the back left leg. That is giving us 4 modifications for the skeleton. And you can see now we have a nice system where we can update all of the individual body parts really easily. All we have to do is update 4 positions, and then we have a whole skeleton following it. Now, before we continue, there are a couple of minor issues. Number 1 is that these joints are on top of the torso, which is not what I want, but that we can fix easily. Inside of visibility on the torso, we can put this on the top level, and that feels a bit better. Also, we have lost the claws on the head of this monster. Inside of the head, you can totally add a few more things. For example, what I want to add is going to be in node 2D, and this node 2D, I want to move to where I want the claw starting position to be, or rather, where I want the point to be that I use to rotate the claw. Roughly here, and then this node is going to get a sprite 2D. This sprite 2D is going to get the claw texture. Then I can move it to the right position. And now on this node 2D, I can use rotate to rotate this claw. Let's rename it to right claw. After that, I can add another node 2D, which will be the left claw. This one we have to move into the right position, here-ish, and then we can give it a sprite 2D with the texture of the left claw. This one we have to flip, once again, x should be -1, and then we can place it in the right position, and now with the left claw rotate, we can move this part as well. Cool. And that was quite a bit of work, but now we have a skeleton that we can animate quite easily. And the skeleton, we don't actually touch that much. Instead, we mostly work inside of the targets. Also know at this point, if I re-enable all of the areas, the collision shape is a bit wrong now. Let's focus on that one. And if I move it back to the right position, roughly here, that is okay. And then inside of the actual game, we can rotate all of this by 90 degrees, and that should still work. Especially for the skeleton, you want to have everything looking up. That makes it much easier to work with. With that, we have the skeleton. Now we just have to figure out how to animate all of that. And for that, you want an animation, not tree, but animation layer. What you can do in there is create a new animation. Let's create one for walk. And for that, you have to animate quite a few properties, but all of them are going to be inside of the targets. For example, front right, we want to move the position. We could have one key for this one. Then we can move the front right at this point. We can move it to the front a bit. Add another keyframe. Then move it all the way to the back. And there you can see, I missed to move the timeline. I want to move all of this back. Then insert another key. And now, if I play this one, we get some kind of animation. This is definitely a bit too slow, so let's speed up all of this. And you always want to end with the starting position, which means I want to duplicate the key and then paste it in there. Now if I run all of this, we get some really basic animation. This is the kind of thing where you want to spend a ton of time on. In my case though, once again, since this is a tutorial, I am going to make this work, but for the refinements, you want to do all of this on your own. So next up, I want to have a property track for the front left and the position. We're going to start with a key, and at the end, we want to have another key. Then somewhere in the middle, we can move it to the front, insert a key there, and then go to this back bit and add a key in there. And now, if I enable looping and play all of this, we get some kind of swimming behavior, which I don't particularly like. So instead, let me get rid of all of the keyframes. And instead, if the right is in the front, I want the left to be in the back. So this is going to be one key. When this part is all the way in the back, I want the left one to be all the way in the front. Insert a key in there, and then this is going to be the rest position. We can just add a key in there. And then for the final bit, we can duplicate the key. If we're trying this one now, that looks definitely better, although once again, this needs a ton of refinement that I don't have the time for. Instead, I want to add another property track, which is for the back right. Once again, I want to have the position, and now we have to sync up the front right leg and the back right leg. And I think the best system is, if the front right leg is all the way to the front, I want to move the back right leg also a bit forwards. Not as much, but still a bit forward. And if you don't sync up these positions perfectly, it looks a bit more organic. So I want to have the extended back leg somewhere here. And then if the front right leg is all the way in the back, I want to move this thing roughly here. Then finally, we can add another key for this part. And at the end, I want to duplicate that key. Let's try the entire animation. And I guess that kind of works. The last property we want to animate is the back left and the position. On there, once again, once the front leg is all the way extended, I want to add a key and have this thing pretty far forward. And if this leg is further back, I want to move it all the way to the back. So in there, I want to add a key. And with that, we get not terribly much working area, so this should move a bit more. Let's do it properly, like this. And then we can have a key in the beginning and a key at the end. And now let's try to play the entire animation. It's not amazing, but for tutorial, definitely good enough. Other than that, I want to have another animation for attack. The attack animation is just going to involve those two parts. Means I want to add a property track on the right claw and the left claw. So those get to have their rotation animated. I want to insert a key for the start position. And then inside of the skeleton, the head, and this is the right claw. We now have a key, so we can animate all of this. I want to go to -60 degrees. Let's say positive 60 actually. For this, I want to add a keyframe. So now we get some movement here. Once we're back there, really quickly, I want to add, let's say -10, maybe -20. And this I want to add in there. What this is going to give us is, this is definitely too slow. This again. I want to extend the claw very slowly outwards and then snap forward, which means this entire animation should be 0.8 seconds long. And next up, the other property we want to animate is going to be the left claw with the rotation. So in there, we have starting position. Then on the left claw, for this one, we should go to -60. Actually, let's randomize this 62 so they don't mirror each other. Then we can add this keyframe. And then for the next part, we can add another key. And this one is going to be, let's say, 23. With that, we are starting and we are snapping shut. Although we don't go back to the starting position. For that, actually, I do want to increase the size or the length of the animation to 1 second. We want to hold this position. So I want to duplicate these keys and duplicate this key. I want to hold this shut. And then by 1 second, I want to go back to the original position. So with that, we are starting there. We snap back, then we snap shut, and then we move back to the starting bit. This I want to do for the left claw as well. And now, let's play the animation. Maybe a bit fast, but I guess that's working. Now, for the rest of the skeleton, you could add quite a bit more stuff, but I'm just going to leave it because this is already getting quite complex. Oh, also, you might have wondered, on the left side, we have a ton of warning positions. This is called the rest position of a skeleton. So our skeleton could have a rest position like this. And if you now have the skeleton, you can click on Skeleton 2D and then override rest pose. A skeleton always wants to have some kind of rest pose, which are all of the standard rotations. Now in our case, this doesn't matter so much, but well, you can learn a lot more about skeletons. I'm once again only scratching the surface. Righty, so now we have the hunter significantly extended. The issue now, inside of the actual game, we have to make all of that work. For that, let me lock the main level, and then I can move the hunter to a better position, so we can see it right away. Let's say in there, and now if I run the game, we are getting some really weird behavior. We can't see the torso at all right now, but the pathfinding is still working, so that's a good start. Let's have a look what went wrong here. Most importantly, in the torso, I think the issue is that top level messed things up. Let's try this one again. That is looking better. Now we have the torso once again. Also, inside of debug, I don't want to have visible navigation anymore. That way we can actually see what's going on. Also, with the navigation agent 2 selected, I want to disable this thing. That way we don't see the red line anymore. All right. There are a couple of things we have to work on. All of those happen inside of the script. At the moment, the hunter is always going to look at the next path position. But this doesn't work anymore because the default rotation goes to the right. But now the bug is looking upwards, so this look at is giving us the wrong thing. Let's get rid of it entirely, actually. Instead, I want to create another variable. We can call this one the look angle. We already know which direction we are going. This we are storing in direction. And on this, I simply want to get the angle. And then I want to get the rotation and set it to this look angle. This is going to give us the same result we have seen earlier. However, what we can do with this system is simply add pi divided by 2. That way, we are adding 1/4 of the full rotation, and then this should be working. Let's try it now. And now the bug should be looking at the player, or at least at the next path position. So if I stand here, the bug should be looking towards me. That is definitely an improvement. All right. Next up, I want to play the walk animation once the bug is walking. Which means once the hunter is noticing the enemy, I want to get the animation player and play the walk animation. Now if we're trying all of this again, once the bug is seeing the player, it is walking towards us. And this is happening because of the skeleton animation. So definitely some decent start. Next up then, we can work on the attack part. For that, I want to have another timer. Let's call it the attack timer. For that, I can minimize these other two functions and this one as well, actually. Let's actually minimize everything. The next function I want to create is the attack area needs to emit a signal. That signal is going to be body entered, and we also need body exited. For both of those, I want to create another Boolean. We can call this one player near, a Boolean, which by default is false. And then this player near is going to be updated via these two functions. If the player is near, so inside of this area, this should be true. And if the player isn't near, then this should be false. Also, I want to add an underscore to these two bodies. So Godot keeps the debugger in check. You might have already noticed the debugger right now gives us 14 errors or warnings, which really isn't good. And quite honestly, I am not sure what the problem here is. This may be a bug with an earlier version of Godot, but for some reason it cannot verify the bone setup, which is giving us all of the errors. I looked around quite a bit and I simply couldn't find a good reason why these happen. So maybe it's a bug, but if it isn't, I'm going to add a comment explaining the issue here. If the player is near, I want to get the animation player again and then play the attack animation. Let's try that one. And now if I get near, we get an attack animation. Although the bug is quite, well, buggy, but, well, we can refine things a tiny bit. Essentially what is happening right now is that the pathfinding is getting a bit weird once the hunter gets too close to the target. And that we can modify. Usually what you do inside of the ready function, you would add two more things. First of all, we want to work with the navigation agent 2D. And in there we have path desired distance. This is usually set to 4.0. Besides that, we can get the navigation agent again. And then we have a target desired distance, which I also want to set to the same value. These numbers, if I open them in the documentation, it's the distance threshold before a path point is considered to be reached. Inside of the game, the player might, for example, be here. And depending on the threshold we have set, the hunter might have considered this point to be reached or not. This, once again, is the kind of thing you want to play around with a lot to get a good looking result. In my case, I think it's not great, but definitely an improvement. Okay, still a bit janky, but I think for now this is fine. Next up then, the hunter needs to have another function that we're going to call attack. If that function gets triggered, we simply want to get globals and the player, not the player position, but I just called this health. And then subtract, let's say 20 points. Now we have to figure out when to call this function, and this happens inside of the animation player, specifically inside of the attack. What I want to do in there is to first of all extend the entire animation to 2 seconds, and then move everything we have so far a bit further to the end. After that, I want to add a call method track on the hunter root node, and all the way at the end of the animation, insert a key, which we can't see right now because we have to save the script. And now, all the way at the end, insert a key with attack. Although, actually, the claw is shutting on this point. So in there, I want to run the attack function. There's just one more thing we need. And then this should only trigger if the player is still in the attack radius once this part of the animation is reached. Which means we just want to check if the player is near, and only then do we want to run all of this. Now, before we can work with all of this, I want to double check the attack area because I think this one is getting a bit weird. Right, so right now, this isn't ideal. The claws don't even reach the player. For that, we can actually move the attack area to this point because this is the only bit where we can attack the player. Let's try all of that. If I now get in there, player gets hit, and this is looking really good. Cool. Which means all we have to do now is to add another timer, which is going to be the hit timer. This hit timer we want to connect to the script right away via timeout. You have seen this multiple times by now. We want to set vulnerable back to true, and then we need a function for hit, so the hunter can be hit if vulnerable is the case. Then we want to reduce the health by a certain amount. And for that, I should create a few more variables. So var vulnerable, a boolean by default, this one is true. Then we have var health. I know, let's say 100 points, which is going to be an integer. And then we can actually work with all of this. If the hunter is vulnerable, then I want to get the health and reduce it by 10. After that, I want to start the hit timer. And by the end of the hit timer, this thing becomes vulnerable again. Finally, we have to get the hit timer and set the wait time to 0.2 seconds. And this one should be one shot. Finally, if the health is smaller or equal to 0, then I want to Q3 the entire scene. Nearly done. The last thing we have to do is the hunter should be inside of the entity group. Let's try all of this now, and I should be able to shoot at the hunter 10 times. And it's actually quite hard to hit once it's pointing at you, but eventually it's going to disappear. With that, we have a much more complex scene. If you look at this on the left, this thing has become really complex, especially if you look at the skeleton, there's a ton of stuff. Now, you could refine all of this a lot more. You could add particle effects, you could add shaders, you could add a lot more. Although in my case, I think we have made this as complex as it needs to be. Everything else you already know. So if you want to refine this, you would have to do it on your own. But at this point, we have covered all of the really difficult stuff. All we have to do now is do some minor refinements and add the sound, and then we are done with this video. The final major part that we have to work on is going to be about adding sound. That, fortunately, is going to be really easy. All you need is one more node. This one is called an audio stream player, and it plays audio. That's kind of all it does. It's not terribly complicated. Although, on top of that, there is a generic one for 2D and one for 3D. The difference between them is that the latter two take the location into consideration, which basically means that the further away the audio source is, the quieter it becomes. Other than that, they are basically identical. There's one more thing that is important to note, and that is when you want to play audio in an animation player. For example, in our case, we're going to play an explosion sound in the explosion animation. To do that, you have to create a separate audio track. Otherwise, you are not going to hear any audio. I'm not quite sure why that is the case, but it's quite easy to implement. Let's do all of that in practice. Here we are back in Godot, and first of all, we have to import a couple of audio files. For that, if you look at the nodes, you will find an audio folder. And there we have a couple of audio files, nothing complicated. This you simply want to drag into Godot, and then you have an audio folder. This one contains, well, the same thing you have just seen. And I suppose, just to get started, I want to play the laser sound as soon as we are shooting a laser, which in Godot term means I want to open the laser scene. And as soon as we are creating this laser, I want to play the sound. For that, we want to add another node that is going to be called an audio stream player. And there you can see we have an audio stream player, an audio stream player 2D, and an audio stream player 3D. The 3D version you only want to use for a 3D game, quite obviously. And the decision if you want to use a 2D one or a normal player depends on if the location of this audio file is important, which for the laser is the case. Because if the scout is shooting the laser far away, it should be less loud. So we want to use an audio stream player 2D. Now we have a new node, and on the right, you have a couple of settings. The one we care about the most is called stream. Right now it's empty, and like for sprite, we have to drag in a file. Once you have that, you can test this file right away. If you click on playing, you should be hearing a laser sound. You can also modify a few more things. For example, you can change the volume or the pitch. I'm not going to touch either of them because I'm happy with the sound as it is, but play around with this if you are interested. There's also an area mask to choose different kinds of areas, but I don't care about any of that. I just want to play some sound. To actually play the sound when this laser is being created, you can approach it in two ways. You can go to the script, and when the laser is ready, meaning inside of the ready function, you can get the audio stream player 2D and then simply play the sound. If you now run all of this, shoot somewhere, and you get the sound. That being said, all of this can be done even easier. If you go back to the node itself, you can simply select autoplay, and then the sound is going to play automatically. Which means if I run the entire thing again, we get the sound once more without writing any code. And well, that's basically what you have to know about the basics of sound. It doesn't get that much more complicated. Although there are two particulars that you do want to be aware of. Number one, if you are using an animation player, for example, if you want to work with the grenade, there we have an animation player, and I want to play a sound once we have an explosion. For that, you could, well, first of all, we have to add an audio stream player. The position here is also important, so this needs to be a 2D one. And in there, you could add a track, a property track, and then add the audio stream player. You could do that, but it would never play sound. Instead, how you would have to use them is with add track and then add audio playback track. I believe the reason why that is because that way you can have some special setup. Now, first of all though, you have to select the audio file you want to play, or rather the audio stream player node. In my case, there's only one, and in there now we have audio clips. The way you would use that is simply to insert a key, then click on the key, and then you can insert the audio file you want to play. In my case, this would be explosion.wav. With that, I can play all of it, and we have a sound. What you could also do is then add more keys with different audio files, although this isn't what I want to do. Next up, there's one more important thing I want to cover. I want to play battle theme A while the game is running, and this should simply start at the beginning of the game and then play continuously. But there is an issue. So for example, what you could be doing is in the outside scene, add an audio stream player and then play it, and then do the same thing for the inside scene. And let me close the laser and the grenade, we don't need either. If you added an audio stream player to both of these, or one to the level, then the issue would be if you load either of them, the audio file would start again from scratch. As soon as you're loading a new scene, you're loading all of it, which means if there is an audio stream player in there, it is going to start playing. And it is going to play from the start. Instead, what you would rather want to do is to create a global scene, which means I want to create a new scene with a node, and we can call this one, let's just call it music. This is going to get one node, which is an audio stream player. This one does not care about the position. And there, I want to add battle theme A, and then click on autoplay. Once I have that, I can go to project, project settings, auto load, and I want to go to my globals. Oh, and I forgot to save the scene. I want to save it under globals, music.tscn is fine. And now I can go to project, auto load, and load music.tscn. Then we can click on add, and now we have another global scene. Since we have set this to autoplay, it should play right from the beginning. Let's try. Okay, perfect. That seems to be working. What is even more important now is that this music is going to continue playing across multiple scenes. Which means if I start at the outside level, we have the same music. All of this should be still fairly straightforward. There's one more thing I do want to do inside of this global scene, and that is I want to loop this music file. For that, you have to go to stream and then click on the audio file. In there you get a few more options. Although right now, if I click on loop, nothing is going to happen. That is because when we imported battle theme A, we have to specify during the import that it can be looped. I have no idea why that is necessary, but it's just the case. It's quite easy to fix. If you go to import next to scene and you have the file selected, you have to enable loop. Now we can re-import it, and now we have loop enabled. Really strange system, but it is what it is. Although now this is all we needed for this scene, so I can close it. Now there's one more issue we really have to work on, and that is when we hit any of the enemies. For example, if I open the bug, we can add a sound quite easily to play something when they get hit. For that, we have a hit function. Unfortunately, when they are attacking. In the bug case, this would be inside of this function. When an enemy is attacking the player, we store all of that information inside of globals.health. This doesn't actually touch the player directly. Which means to play a sound on the player being hit, we have to work inside of globals. So globals, and we have to figure out how to play a sound purely from a script. And that could be a fun thing to figure out. It's not actually that hard. The way you want to approach it, all the way at the top, I want to create a variable that is going to be a player hit sound. This has to be an audio stream player 2D. The trick with this one is that we can simply create entirely new nodes in script. At the bottom of this script, I want to create a ready function, which is still going to run as soon as this script here is ready. Inside of there, I want to get my player hit sound and assign it an audio stream player 2D. And to create a new node, you want the new method. This is going to create a whole new node. Next up, on this node, we have to specify what kind of sound we want to play. So what kind of sound from these we want to use. This we can set with player hit sound, and then stream needs to load a file. The file we want to use is called solid impact, and you can simply drag it in there. That's all you need. Finally, there's one more thing that we do have to do. And let me give all of this a bit more space. At the moment, we have a node, and this node has a stream, so file. The last thing we have to do is to add this node to this script, which we do with add child. We have seen this one before, and we want to add the player hit sound. What this one now is going to do, if I run the entire the basic way you have to think about it is that I earlier said that this is just a script, but that wasn't entirely correct. Anytime you create a script in Godot, this script has to be attached to a node. And if you just create a script, so if you go to the file system on the left and click on new script, Godot is going to create a basic node and then attach a script right away to it. Meaning you always have a node when you have a script. But alright, now that we have that, all we have to do is to play this player hit sound. This is going to happen inside of this health. More specifically, inside of the second if statement, we are checking if the player gets hurt. I want to play the player hit sound with the play method. Now that we have that, back in the outside scene under enemies, I want to add the scout, and we can place him a bit further down so I can actually select him, and let's put him there. If I now run the game, all of that seems to be perfectly fine, so now we can do an exercise. All I want you to do is to add a sound to the crates and toilets once they get hit, and on top of that, add a sound to the bug, drone, and scout once they get hit. Pause the video now and try to implement that one. I guess we can start with the bug. This one, first of all, is going to need an audio stream player 2D, and for the audio, I want to have organic impact. This is going to be the stream, and now I have to figure out when to play it. This we can figure out in the script, and it's quite easy. I talked about this earlier. We have to work inside of this if statement in the hit function. All we have to do is get the audio stream player 2D and then play the thing. If I now go back to outside and I am going to add the bug, and it's going to be quite hard to drag him because we have so much stuff in there. If I now run the entire thing, and we definitely get a flashy kind of sound. Although for now, I want to remove all of the enemies because they are going to get quite confusing. That fixes the bug. Next up, I want to work on the scout. The scout already plays a sound. Every time he shoots a laser, he is playing the same laser scene as the player, which already contains the laser sound. Although on top of that, I want to also give him an audio stream player 2D. And you could also rename them. Let's call it the hit sound. It's really up to you. For this one, I want to use solid impact, the same thing we have for the player. And then inside of the script, we are doing the same thing we have done for the bug. I want to get the hit sound and then play it. That covers another part. And next up, I want to work on the drone. For the drone, we need 2 bits, which means I want to add a node, and this node I'm going to rename to sounds. The first sound is going to be an audio stream player 2D. Let's call this one the hit sound. The hit sound is going to be solid impact, and this we want to play once the drone gets hit, which we have done a couple of times at this point. We are working inside of the hit function, and I want to get the hit sound and play it. That should be quite easy. And next up, I want to add another audio stream player, which is going to be the explosion sound. This one is going to get explosion.wav, and this we want to play via the animation player, more specifically inside of explosion. For that, once again, inside of add track, we have to add an audio playback track with explosion sound. And I just realized, since we're using that inside of the explosion sound, we don't have to add this stream in there. This happens all in the animation player. What I want to do in there is to insert a key, and there I can insert the explosion sound, like so. And now I want to line this up a bit better so it starts with the animation. Let's try all of that. So in the outside scene, I want to add a drone, and this drone we have to move over there. And while we are testing all of this, I think it's going to be a good idea to get the global music scene and disable autoplay. That way I can actually hear what's going on. Let's try all of this now. We get one sound, and if I hit the drone off the note, we get a very faint explosion sound. This we probably want to make a bit louder. So in the drone, I want to get the explosion sound, and in there volume.dB, let's set it to 10. Let's see how that's going to work. A bit better, maybe 20. You do want to be really careful with volume because it gets very loud very quick. Okay, also on top of that, inside of the animation, this one is starting a bit too late. Let's put it earlier. Once again, this is a kind of thing that you can play around with for ages. I think that feels about right. With that, next up, we can open the item container. This one is the parent for the toilet and the parent for the crate. Which means if we are adding an audio stream player to it and save it, we also have the same thing inside of the children. Since they all have the same sound, container hit, we can place it inside of the parent. Next up, inside of the toilet, inside of the hit function, I simply want to get the audio stream player 2D and then play the sound. The same thing I want to do in the crate. So in there, audio stream player 2D and play. Once again, the hit method for the toilet and the crate are really similar. And you could probably outsource quite a bit of the logic to the item container parent. But anyway, let's try all of this. If I now go to we get a sound. That is quite metally. And next up, let's try the toilet. I think the nearest one is down here. There's a toilet. And this also has a sound. Perfect. That covers the item containers, so I can close them as well. And next up, we have to work on the item. And there, we actually have a bit of an issue. But let's go through it first. I want to add an audio stream player 2D to the item itself. And this one is getting item.mp3. You can just drag it in there. And now we have to figure out when to play it. This should happen when the player is colliding with it. So all the way at the end, before we are destroying the scene, I want to get the audio stream player 2D and play the sound. But that isn't quite going to work, and I hope you can see why. Basically, if I open a crate, we don't get a sound. and that is because we are playing the sound, but then right away we are destroying the scene. And once you have destroyed the scene, you can't hear the audio anymore. Which means we want to wait for Q3 until the sound is finished playing. That you can get with await, and I want to get the audio stream player, and then wait for is finished. Although that is going to cause another issue. If I go back to outside and get rid of the drone, because that's a bit annoying, I can now try all of this again, and if I now go to the crate, we still get the items, and if I collect them, we basically have the sound, but then the item sticks around for about half a second. So the issue for this one, in the item, once the player is touching them, we are playing the sound, and while the sound is playing, you can still see the item. And only once the sound is finished, we are destroying the node, which is causing a delay where it feels like we are touching the item, but the item doesn't disappear right away, which looks really weird. An easy workaround for that is to simply hide the sprite 2D. So sprite2d.hide, and that fixes the issue. It's a bit of a workaround, but since the item is simple, this works just fine. If I try all of this one again, we can shoot the crate, and now the item disappears right away. So this is working just fine. Perfect. And, well, I can basically continue like this forever. We could add a lot more sound, but I think for the purposes of this tutorial, this is all that we need. If you understand this so far, you can add sounds. It's not that difficult. Which means we have another important section covered. Alrighty, we are nearly done. All we have to do now is add some final touches, and then this is a complete game. Most importantly, while editing all of this, I have realized that the background music was way too loud. So that we have to change, and on top of that, we have to update the mouse cursor. Then finally, we can place all of the enemies, and then this is done. Here we are back in Godot, and let me show my cursor. If I now run the game, the main issue is that we have the standard cursor. This doesn't look very good. To change that, you want to go to Project, Project Settings, and there, under Display, we have Mouse Cursor. All we have to do is select a custom image. This we get from Graphics, and there we have UI, and in there we have Crosshair 159. I want to open that one, and for now, let's just close it. If we now run all of this again, we have a much better looking crosshair. Everything else is also working just fine. Although, at the moment, we have to make some more updates. Specifically, we have a custom image hotspot. What does that mean? Normally, when you have a mouse, that one looks something like this. This is the normal mouse. And when you click on any button, the actual point that matters on it is this bit on the top. This 1 pixel is what you actually control. The entire rest of the image is just an image. It doesn't do anything. And, well, this hotspot is this one point that we actually control. In a normal mouse, this is always the top left, meaning position 0 and 0. In our case, though, the crosshair is a bit different. We have, in the image, a rectangle, and this rectangle is 34 by 34 pixels. The size doesn't actually matter. The only reason why I'm talking about it is because the hotspot in our case is the center of it, which means for the actual hotspot, we don't want 0 and 0, we want 17 and 17, or half the width and half the height of this image. Although, since we don't have any buttons in the game, this isn't going to be too visible. But if I now run the game, you can't really see that much of a difference, but this is a slightly cleaner setup. That wasn't so difficult. All we have to do now, I guess, first of all, with the background music selected, I want to lower the volume quite a bit. Let's say -10. That way it doesn't overpower all of the other sounds. On top of that, this should be set to autoplay, and then I can close music in the outside scene. And let me extend the node tree. Pretty much all that I want to do is add a whole bunch of enemies and scatter them throughout the level. For now, I want to get the hunter, because this one we definitely have to place outside here somewhere. Also, the level barriers I want to lock because they are going to get in the way. Same for the lights. And now we can move the hunter very easily. Let's place him here. Actually here, that feels better. After that, I want to add the scout. And the scout, I want to scatter through in a couple of places. Let's say one here. We can place another one there. And we could place another one, let's say a couple down there. Since the scout is on top of the building, I can also place them inside it. I guess you don't want to have too many of them, but place them wherever you like them to be. After that, I want to add the drone. And the drone, let's say we can have one here and one here. And all of this is getting really busy, but well, if you have a more complex level, this is simply what you have to deal with. This should cover everything for the outside level. Next up, the inside level, we have a few more enemies. While we are working with those, I want to disable the directional light. That way I can actually see what's going on. Most importantly, in the inside level, I want to add quite a few of the bugs. Those are in the center, and especially the area down here should have one of them. I don't know, you can just place them wherever you want. And we should have a few more around this bit. I guess here one, there, and we can add two over there. After that, I want to have a few more scouts scattered throughout. So the scout, can have one there, and then one up here. I keep on repeating myself. On actual level, you would spend a lot of time on this to place elements in the right position, to actually design a level. That, unfortunately though, is quite an intensive process. But anyway, with that, we have covered the entirety of the thing, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.